Wait, 1, 2, 3. Hello and welcome, everyone. We're delighted that you're here for our first ever Here and Now event, Global Protest in Context. My name is Max Orr. I'm the director of the program in the humanities here at UNC. The program in the humanities has been around since 1979. It's our job to take scholarship and put together programs and provide it for the community in events like this and through other programs. I would steer you to our website, humanities.unc.edu, to take a look at our full roster of events. All undergraduate students at UNC can attend our events for free. And somewhat related to the topics we have today, we have events coming up in September on the Arab Spring. We have an entire all-day seminar in October on modern Egypt with 3 excellent scholars from NC State, UNC, and Duke, all collaborating to talk about modern Egypt, as well as a whole other roster of programs. So please look that over. This program started through just interested parties all around saying we should do something a little bit more timely. When an event happens, we should be able to address it in a timely manner. The way we normally do our programming is we all look at the semester ahead and organize our seminars. So through the collaboration of the General Alumni Association, the excellent Center for Islamic Studies here at UNC, we've just had a really wonderful collaboration and pulled this together, and we're so delighted that you've all come. First, I would like to turn over the microphone to Regina Higgins, and she's from the Carolina Center for the Study of the Middle East and Muslim Civilizations. Regina.
Thank you, Max, and thank you, everybody, for coming. We're very, very happy to collaborate with you, Max, and what could be more global than humanities and human values for the FedEx Global Education Center? That's everything. So we are here to be thinking globally. We're also thinking of our own state, and we're thinking of the Middle East. The Carolina Center for the Study of the Middle East and Muslim Civilizations deepens understanding of the Middle East and of Islam on campus and off campus. I have left sign-up sheet for our listserv in case you would like to know more about us and about our events. I hope to see you many times this year as we go through the year. But for now, I'm going to turn it back over to Max, and thank you for being here again, and let's have a great discussion.
Thank you, Regina. And we have, when we're putting it together, we said, who are the great scholars that we can ask to present to us and also to help us run this show? And we are really lucky to have found this fellow, because he is going to be taking over from here and being our moderator and host for the event and giving us a break. He has a much nicer voice than I have. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Omid Safi. He is professor of Islamic Studies here at Carolina. He received his PhD from a community college up the road in Durham called Duke University in 2000. We have to do that here at Carolina. And he came to Carolina in 2006 after teaching at Colgate in New York. He's an outspoken public scholar and expert on progressive Islamic thought, the social intellectual history of pre-modern Islam, and Islamic mysticism. Among his edited and authored publications are Progressive Muslims on Justice, Gender, and Pluralism, The Politics of Knowledge in Pre-Modern Islam, and Memories of Muhammad, Why the Prophet Matters. His blogs, articles, and commentaries on Muslim life, domestic and international politics, and religion appear regularly on national news sites and other venues and make him truly an engaged scholar and the perfect moderator for tonight's event. So please give a warm welcome for Dr. Omid Safi. There we go.
All right, friends. So allow me to also welcome you. And I have the great privilege of introducing our other speakers first, and then I plan to start a revolution. A non-violent one, admittedly, but a revolution where knowledge and practice and liberation, hopefully, will be seen as being intimately linked together. We have the audacity to think that what happens in North Carolina, that what happens in Washington, that what happens in Egypt, that what's happening in Turkey and in Syria are actually connected with one another. We have the audacity to think that your generation can fix this incredibly messed up world that my generation has created. because you all are smarter than we are. You're more committed, you're more networked, you're more aware. And if we can just get over this fear that you are insignificant and your lives don't matter and you will never have a job, and allow you to realize the phenomenal power that you have to transform yourselves and transform the world around you, we just might get somewhere. And this should be, I hope, the beginning of the conversation and the last time that people of our generation are just sitting there talking at you, and very quickly we move to talking together. Allow me to introduce the superstars that we have on the panel. Zeynep Tofekci is an assistant professor in the School of Information and Library Science with an appointment in the Department of Sociology. She received her BA in sociology from Istanbul University and pursued an undergrad degree in computer science from Boğaziçi University before completing her PhD at University of Texas. She served at the Center for Information Technology Policy at Princeton and has taught at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Please welcome Dr. Zeynep Tofekci. And further down, we have Doria Al-Kerdani, who's a lecturer in Arabic in the Department of Asian Studies here at UNC, a native of Cairo. She attended Cairo University, where she studied journalism, and the American University in Cairo, where she received her MA in Arabic instruction. She is an accomplished journalist, author, and educator, has been with us at UNC since 2009, and has just published her first novel, Rimel Naima, which means fine quicksand, is that right? And is working on the second one. So we are delighted to also have you with us, since you just came back from spending a summer in Cairo. So please welcome Doria Al-Kerdani also. We may or may not have Professor Robert Korstad joining us from Duke. We might have decided that having one devil on a panel is more than enough evil than this room can contain. And if Robert comes, we'll be delighted to have him and to welcome him. So I am going to step over there and talk by showing some pretty pictures. So the image that you have here on the stage is undoubtedly the image that a lot of you, a lot of us, have been seeing on TV over the course of the last week or so, and the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. We saw two commemorations, in fact, one by the people and one by the politicians. And the tone of these two commemorations was decidedly different from one another. And I want us to think about why it is that those two felt so different. Let me remind you that the organizers of the original 1963 march made a decision, and the decision was no politicians. No politicians, because this mass movement was designed to speak to the government, not from the perspective of the government. It was designed to push the government to do what was right and pass civil rights legislation. And of course, here we are 50 years later, having made some important and significant progress in certain areas and backsliding in horrific ways in others. And that backsliding is taking place right where we are situated, among the worst examples in the entire country. When you're being put in the same bracket as Wisconsin, as places that are taking the greatest steps backward, it makes you think about what's going on. And when you have a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court that says the way to end racism is to stop talking about racism, it makes you realize just how much more work we as a people have to do. So what is it that we did not hear in this mass protest and the commemoration that we saw there? Well, if you go back to 1963, you recognize that the march is about racism, but it's actually called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. In other words, recognizing that economic justice and racial justice are organically linked up together. Acknowledging that these two hit certain members of our society, people of color, like a double whammy most of the time, but there was an adamant insistence on the fact that we as a people need and deserve working jobs. Jobs where if we work for 40 hours a week, we should be able to feed our families. It's not such an outrageous idea. How do you know that? Look at the program that was handed out. The program that lists the speakers, an imperfect list of speakers, because it's all men. There are women who are on the stage, but all they're allowed to do is to sing. Rosa Parks is on the stage, but she's not allowed to speak. Mahalia Jackson is on the stage, and she can sing a gospel song, but not speak about her experiences. So let us not make the mistake of thinking that we had to reach the pinnacle of an holistic sense of justice. And if you take a look at the back of that same program, what we demand, access to all public accommodations and decent housing. And there's a good conversation to be had about what is the state of public accommodation, public transportation, public education, and public housing right here in America in 2013. The right to vote where democracy is supposed to make it easier for people to vote and to expand the circle of people that have a chance to participate in a democracy. And you now have representatives in your state legislature who are trying to make sure that people of your generation have a much, much harder time to vote. In the western part of North Carolina, there are one-stop voting places that have 11 parking spots for thousands of people. Why do you think that is? Because they know that younger people overwhelmingly vote Democratic. They're trying to make it harder for very elderly people who no longer have valid driver's license to vote, because elderly people overwhelmingly vote Democratic. People of color are also being targeted. And if you keep going down the list of what we demand, you get to number 8, a National Minimum Wage Act that will give Americans a decent standard of living. Anything less than $2 an hour fails to do this. So, some people say, well, now the minimum wage is what? $7.25? So we met our goal. Wrong. $2 in 1963 is between $13 and $15 an hour. That's what we marched for in 1963. And if you want to get a sense of what that means, think about a society in which you work 40 hours a week, and once you paid your rent and once you paid your food, you've got nothing left. And that is the reality of the working poor in our country. That was what the Job and Freedom March was partially designed to counteract. And we did so much to honor and remember Dr. King, and we should, but we also sanitized him in the process. Because we made 2 catastrophic, deliberate mistakes. The first mistake was in reducing the march, and in many ways the civil rights era, to Dr. King. We forgot about the fact that there were labor unions. There were decades and decades of African American and white allies working together. There were women's rights movements that predated the involvement of Dr. King. And that Martin's life and activism did not end in 1963 on those steps in Washington. He continues to grow, not because he's sitting in his study and reading, but because he's talking with you. There are students who form an organization called SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinated Committee, who push him to see the connection between the injustice here and the injustice there, who say that the racism in America is organically connected to the colonial experience of people in Africa and to the colonial wars in Vietnam. And after 4 years of being pushed, a Nobel Peace Prize winning, beloved preacher of the South being pushed by your generation, that Martin comes to Riverside Church, a transformed man, and says, the time comes to break the silences. The time comes to speak against the betrayal of my own soul. And he begins to speak out against Vietnam and to connect the policies of the American empire to the racism at home. That Martin is a Martin that we didn't hear from. We did not hear the President Obama touch him with a 10-foot pole. Because if we were going to listen to that Obama talk about that Martin, we would have to listen Martin in Riverside's church talking about my own government, the American government, as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. We would have to listen to that Martin say, I started the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, back in 1957 because there's something wrong with the soul of America, and the soul of America needs to be redeemed. That was the motto of the organization he started, to redeem the soul of America. And he says, if America dies and you do an autopsy on it, the answer is going to come back, war. If in 1967 that Martin would have said, America is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, what does the tradition of Martin have to tell us today? What does it mean when Republican candidate and Democratic candidate sit in presidential debates and agree, nodding approvingly, when the moderator asks them, the United States spends more on the military than the next 12 countries combined? Because that Martin would have said this, that a nation that continues year after year to spend more on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. That's a Martin that's uncomfortable for us to deal with, and so we don't want to acknowledge him. The Martin of Riverside Church is someone that we'd rather not go to. And it's that prophetic tradition that we're now seeing in North Carolina. Martin was right. It is when the night is darkest that you can see the stars the best. It is precisely because in North Carolina you're seeing an assault on your rights, on the rights of the poor, on the rights of the elderly, on health care, on education, on immigrants, on Muslims, on others, gays and lesbians, that now you're seeing in North Carolina this prophetic movement, the Moral Monday movement led by Reverend Barber, that begins as a small trickle of people and leads up to thousands. And I know that we have people here who've been there. I know that we have people here who've been arrested in Moral Mondays. And the beautiful thing about it is that they are a living example of what Martin ends up his life recognizing, that justice is holistic, that the injustice against blacks is connected to the injustice against the poor, is connected to the injustice of the American militaristic empire. And if you were paying attention to the video that we played from the Moral Monday, that's what Reverend Barber is saying. There might have been a time where women's groups and gays and lesbian groups and African American groups and church groups and Muslim groups and civil rights groups wouldn't have come together. But now we're here, all of us together. That's one of the aspects of coalition building. That's one of the distinctive features of this generation and this movement. I spent a good chunk of my summer out of North Carolina, actually in Turkey. And what was odd was seeing the ways that the governor of North Carolina was dismissing his own citizens exactly the same way that the increasingly dictatorial prime minister of Turkey was dismissing his own people. So, Governor McCrory, standing next to the guy who's hell-bent on the destruction of a public university. Make no mistake about it. This is an assault on public education. How do you do it? You cut their budget $500 million, which is what has happened to my university and your university. And when people rise up and connect their suffering and connect their experiences, what does the governor say? He says, these are just a group of outsiders. These are outside agitators. And we actually had to have our newspapers and academics go around interviewing people to find out where they're from, and lo and behold, 311 out of 316 are from right here in North Carolina. We are not from planet Communistan. We're not Northeast liberals or West Coast hippies. We're North Carolinians. And the same thing happens in Turkey, where the prime minister dismisses the people in Taksim Square and Gezi Park as looters, bums, and people motivated by outside sources. It's a refusal for those in power to actually listen to the people to whom they're supposed to be accountable and responsible. I want to touch upon some of the other parts of the world and leave it to our next two speakers, possibly three once they get here, and start with the conversation in Egypt, where, largely speaking, groups of people in your age group, again, led a popular revolution to displace Hosni Mubarak, a dictator that had been supported by the United States for 30 years. Remember, Egypt is the second largest recipient of US foreign aid right after Israel. And yes, they use Twitter and Facebook, but for the sake of God and the prophets, let's not make the mistake of thinking that Twitter causes revolution. If it did, all of my students, and myself included, who spend 6 hours a day on Facebook, would all be instant revolutionaries. Most of the time, you're just forwarding stupid cat pictures and Miley Cyrus. You are doing nothing to actually uplift and transform people. Twitter and Facebook are a tool. Sometimes you can use it to organize and to mobilize. Sometimes you end up just being a tool. So, in Egypt was one of the first times that we saw particularly young people who say, I am unafraid. Or even better yet, I am afraid of what could happen to me, but I refuse to allow my fear to silence me. That my fear is a part of me, but there's more to me than this feeling of being scared. We saw for a brief period of time in Tahrir Square another one of these coalitions coming together, which, as of course we've seen over the course of the last year, has now ended up disbanded. And one of the conversations that we need to have is, what is it that happens to nonviolent revolutions? What happens when these coalitions fall apart and people start turning on each other? What happens to them and what happens to us? What happens to us when we stand up and celebrate the imprisonment of people who are rising up against dictators, but we're largely silent when the people who are being killed and imprisoned are Islamists, which is exactly what's happened. About 1,000 people have been killed, and like him or not, and I'm not a huge fan of him, from all accounts, a fairly elected president of the country is now sitting in jail, and TV and radio stations sympathetic to them are shut down. Right? Is this a move towards democracy that we should be supporting? In the early stages of the revolution in Egypt against Mubarak, you saw Muslims and Christians, Copts, coming together to protect one another. And now, of course, you're seeing the escalation of ethnic and religious and sectarian divisions. And you have these powerful, iconic moments that should remind us of what took place in our own country on the bridges of Selma, where groups of young people against John Lewis and others marched against police forces. And the beautiful part for us is here you have a demonstration on the left taking place in Wisconsin against their dim-witted governor. And Wisconsin folks are proudly holding up signs, "Walk like an Egyptian," identifying their own struggle with what's taking place in Tahrir Square. And in Egypt, in Tahrir Square, Egyptians are holding up signs in support of union workers in Wisconsin. At least some of us recognize that our struggles are shared and are reaching out to one another. This is a new thing for us as human beings, and it's time to acknowledge it and celebrate it. And here's one place where you can use social media as a useful tool. You got Egyptian activists who are not just with their bodies and their signs, but also their social media, expressing their loyalty to what people in the richest country on earth are struggling to accomplish, because not everybody in the richest country on earth is rich or even middle class. Syria, of course, it's hard and achingly difficult today in Syria, where there's over 100,000 people killed, where there are over 2 million people driven out of their own country, where there are over 5 to 6 million people displaced inside their own country, to remember that Syria had an initial nonviolent revolution, that people stood up and proclaimed in English, so you could see it, "We want freedom for all." And of course, Bashar al-Assad ended up turning on them, and that movement, in many important ways, has also been hijacked and appropriated. And the result of what we have in Syria today is a destruction and devastation that defies words, leading, of course, to the chemical weapon attack of August 21st, which now leaves us in this situation of having this fictitious conversation about what do we do? Do we allow genocide to go on, or do we bomb people allegedly to liberate them, as if there are no other options on the table? And the irony of all ironies, the person pushing for that unilateral action is the Nobel Peace Prize winning president who stood where Martin stood. So we have, fortunately, people here to speak much more eloquently and much more knowledgeably about the events in Turkey and in Egypt. Let me wrap it up by just pointing about part of what took place in Turkey, and I happened to be there with a group of about 70 people this summer as the protests in Gezi Park and Taksim Square were going on. And this is what the Turks were watching. CNN International kept running coverage of the demonstrations in Gezi Park and Taksim Square, whereas CNN Turk had a documentary about penguins. Penguins. We need to ask the questions, what are we being shown, and in whose interest is this? You saw examples of a graduate student from Istanbul, Şeyda, who ended up becoming one of the iconic representations where she was subjected to tear gas, and her hair flying and the beautiful red dress that she was wearing became sort of one of the iconic moments of the savagery of police brutality against defenseless civilians. And this is from places that I was taking some of my friends to over the summer. What is littering the ground are tear gas canisters. largely produced in Pennsylvania and sold to Turkey, expedited to Turkey. So people around the world relate to us, yes, as this model of democracy and freedom, and also as the Made in USA tear canisters. That's our mixed legacy that we are leaving around the world. And I'll end with the words of the Turkish Prime Minister, where he ended up calling the people who were protesting against him çapulcu, bums, hooligans. And in a pretty clever move, they ended up appropriating that insult and turning it around. So saying that you're çapulling ended up just meaning this cool kind of a thing. It's now, you know you've made it when it's now in urbandictionary.com, right? So there's power in recognizing your ability to take the words of someone attacking you and making it your own in that sense. And I'll leave for you to think about just the words of one of the American presidents who was dealing and struggling with many of these same issues, who was President Kennedy. And when President Kennedy was confronted with the challenges that his own society was faced with, he asked about the actions of people when they're confronted with peaceful revolutions. And the people who make peaceful revolutions impossible make violent revolutions necessary. We have a sense of what it is that we like to see for the world community, what it is that we like to see in Syria, in Egypt, in Turkey, and in our own country. And if what we want to insist on is that resorting to violence is the wrong way of going about it, what is it that we, as a morally informed citizenry, are committed to do to make their and our peaceful revolutions possible? Thank you for your time, and we will have time for questions in a little bit. How should we do this? Let me welcome Doria. Is it Doria or Zainab who's going next? Zainab. Zainab, why don't you go next? And then we'll leave time for questions. And Robert's not here yet, is that right? Oh, you did come. Wonderful. Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so please.
So hi everyone, my name is Zeynep Tüfekçi, and I unfortunately don't have such cool pictures, but I'm really glad that you showed so many, so that I can probably just write on your coattails for that. So I am a researcher of social movements and new media. I actually study broadly impacts of technology on a lot of social processes, including social movements. And I had done research on the Arab Spring. I've been in Egypt, I've been in Tahrir, I've been, both interviews and observations. And I had, in fact, spent a lot of the year that the Arab Spring, the initial year, sort of traveling to the region. And then I had been writing up my findings as an academic. That's what you do, and I blog, and I'm sort of out there as a public person too, and this is such an exciting, interesting time to be studying these things. When two stories, basically, on topics I study and who I am broke in the same week. One of them was the Gezi protests in Turkey that you just alluded to, which were the biggest spontaneous demonstrations in Turkey in at least a generation. Spontaneous generations, sort of grassroots demonstrations in Turkey are quite rare. Large demonstrations, large protests are not. But these unorganized, spontaneous protests of the Arab Spring type are incredibly rare, and these were these large protests, and social media had played a major role. On the other, and on the other hand, the very same week, a story broke on NSA surveillance and what was going on there. So I found myself in this really odd position of having a subject I studied, for my academic life, something I've always been very interested in, part of social movements, have a major research and political event happen in my home country the very week that a very major story on surveillance and privacy, my other strain of research, happened. I just sort of thought I can't possibly follow both of these and do research on both of these at the same time. And I was very much pulled to go to Turkey to do research on the ground. So I experienced a lot of the things that you just saw. I did a lot of interviews in the park. I did a lot during the occupation, which I'm going to talk about. And I looked at many things. But my mind was always partially drawn here. So I want to tell you a little bit about what happened. And I want to tell you a little bit about why it's also connected to the NSA revelations that we're hearing about what they are. And because I think it's one of the things that your generation really needs to, pay attention, own up, and decide how to shape your own future. Because future is being shaped in many ways. And in a few decades, a lot of things that are in contention now will become what we call black boxes. They'll just be there, and they won't be up for grabs the way they are. So in Turkey, what happened is there's a government that has been in its 11th or 12th year of power. It is a strong government. It has about 50% of the popular vote, although it has a little more than that in the parliament. And it's been ruling Turkey relatively successfully. The economy is growing. There are a lot of constituencies that have benefited from some of its implementations. Social services have been expanded. The austerity that plagues Europe, where they're cutting everything across the board, is not what's happening in Turkey. So that wasn't the problem. What had happened was the same government that had come to power with the popular vote had also grown increasingly authoritarian. What I say goes. As somebody said to me, they may have 40, 50% of the vote, but they're ruling like they're 90% of the population. There was this great move to transform government and the state and destroy in the process some of the key things: rule of law, separation of powers, the due process. That sound like boring words, due process, who cares? It sounds like this boring thing that legal people should learn, or rule of law, separation of forces. They are not at all boring once you start missing them, once you realize what it means not to have the government have checks and balances in power. So what was happening was the checks and balances in Turkey, which were never great to begin with, were being eroded in a very particular way. And a lot of people were angry about this. But here's the thing, though, and here's where the tool and the technological environment matters. A lot of people were feeling these feelings, and they were upset about what was going on. But how do you know if you're the only one, or if there's 50 of you, or if there's 1,000 of you? A lot of times, social movements have to figure out, who's out there? When the Montgomery bus boycott, which was this crucial event in the civil rights movement, started, the very first day, the biggest fear the organizers had was, is anybody going to show up? They had no idea if it would be a complete flop or a complete success, and they were really scared. And it, as we know, was a great success, but it could have been, and we see this in the history of social movements, it could have been a great flop too. Let me try to say it this way. Let's say you're now thinking, oh wait, the previous speaker, he had great pictures and he was like just sort of getting us all excited, and she's really boring. I don't really like this. Do you think I can leave? Let's say you're just thinking this right now, and you're sitting somewhere in the middle row. Now, what's the odds that you can really get up from the middle of the row and just, very visibly walk out? Not very much, right? It wouldn't be polite. Your professors might be around. Your friends are here. So you're just going to sit through this. And if you're really, really bored, you can probably go online and do the cat pictures and whatever else. Now, imagine if we had a hashtag. Imagine if there was a back channel where I wasn't just speaking at you, but you were speaking amongst each other. And people were like, just droning on, really. I can't see the hashtag, but you're just talking about this. And you said, all right, on the count of 3, are we going to do this? And if this was a public conversation, it would give you a different kind of confidence than being that only person who's thinking, I don't like the speaker, but I don't really know if anybody else doesn't like the speaker. Because a lot of times, the people who govern over you by making it hard for you to stand up and say, I don't like what's going on. There are high costs to being a dissenter. It's not a coincidence that China gives 20 years to a single blogger who's opposing some minor thing. It's not that the Chinese government really thinks one blogger is going to, threaten the Chinese Communist Party's power. That's not it. The problem is, if you let one person do this, and if you let people organize, how many are there? You want to just sort of get them early and scare them and make an example of them. This is what governments and forces that want to prevent collective action try to do, is make it hard for you to be the first one. Now, fast forward a little bit to the first uprising in Egypt, in the Tahrir. One of the things they had that other social movements did not have was a Facebook invite to the revolution. It must have been the first revolution in history where you could say, click, yes, I am attending the revolution. Now, this sounds like funny, but you're not just clicking, yes, I accept your invite, and is it BYOB or not, and that's not it, right? The point is, when you click that, your social network sees that too. The people, and in Egypt, people Facebook friend each other like crazy. It's like you just meet somebody and 2 minutes later they're Facebook friending you, and 5 minutes later their cousin is Facebook friending you, and 8 minutes later their cousin's coworker is Facebook friending you. It really is, this Facebook friending norm is a very strong norm. So there's a lot of large networks that blend families and adults and children and cousins and coworkers. Everything we hate about Facebook, when your mom gets on Facebook and putting comments on your wall, did you wear a sweater? It's kind of cold, and you're like, delete, 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 and you're putting her unlimited profile. Now, everything you hate about Facebook is stuff that makes it really great if you're a political organizer, because it's hard to keep these audiences separate. So if people start saying, yes, I'm going to Tahrir, yes, I'm going to Tahrir, yes, I'm going to Tahrir, it becomes more obvious. You can kind of get strength. I interviewed a lot of activists who had gone to Tahrir on January 25, which was a previous day of protest too, the year before and the year before and the year before. And it was 150 of them and 3,000 cops, and you just show up and there's 3,000 cops and you get beaten up and you go home if you're not arrested. I mean, it was kind of a ritual that they knew. When it was January 24, 2011, they told me they started realizing it was going to be different. Partly, of course, Tunisia, very important. Al Jazeera is an important player. But partly because they were looking at Facebook and seeing people in their network who had never been activists saying, yes, I'm going, yes, I'm going. So the very first day, instead of 150 of them, there was 5,000 to 10,000 of them. And then it just snowballed from there. So the technology and the tool and the configuration of the tool allows people to speak each other in particular ways. And our ability to speak to each other is a very deeply political act, because not speaking to each other is what isolates people, and not understanding each other is what isolates people, either as individuals as groups or families. And sometimes, the speaking to each other is over silly things, the cats and the funny things and all of those things that we play around with. But ironically, sometimes it's those very environments that are so lighthearted that draw everybody to them, because they're lighthearted, become so powerful because there's an audience there. Instead of the people, I interviewed some people in Egypt who'd been bloggers, who had political bloggers, very brave thing to do under Mubarak. They were put in jail, and he came out during the time Facebook was introduced in Egypt. And it was like, nobody's reading my blog anymore, because his blog was this political thing, whereas a lot of political discussions were happening on the social networks, where people both interacted with their acquaintances, but the political activists interjected their political message to those conversations. Now, if there's nobody interested in your discussion, then it's not going to go anywhere. But if there is, then it was quite powerful in getting people to get that courage. Now, let's fast forward a little bit to Turkey. What happened in Turkey is there's a little park near Taksim, and the government the prime minister wanted to raise the little park, and change there's like so few trees are in Istanbul. It's a very overbuilt city. So there's a little park with a few trees left. And I kid you not, his idea was to build a replica of an Ottoman-era barracks that had once stood there. But of course, what the heck is the use of barracks in the middle of, it's like Times Square, right? What's the use of barracks there? So he proposed that it would be part shopping mall and part like luxury residences. You just couldn't find a worse plan for the area. You'd have to like sit and think hard. What could be worse? Ottoman barracks that are shopping mall and luxury residences in the middle of one of the most vibrant neighborhoods in Turkey. And let's raise the few remaining trees in the area to do that, right? This isn't going to really be popular. And people had been challenging this in court. People had been sort of trying very hard for years to stop this development. But this erosion of rule of law I told you about had blocked them. They couldn't even get plans. I interviewed people who told me they couldn't even get the plans for these barracks that were going to be built. It was kind of like the prime minister wants it, it's going to happen. And that upset people. The problem, as he showed you, the media, is that the media outlets in Turkey are owned by large corporate conglomerates who own them as a way to be nice to the government. They don't own them to interrogate and hold the government accountable and run investigations. What they mostly do is run very, very sort of puff pieces on how great the government is with a few little things, and then get government bids and contracts for their other businesses. So, not having a free and independent press that's standing up and doing investigations, you really start feeling how bad that can be. So when people heard that the bulldozers were coming to get the trees, a few dozen people showed up. And they were trying to hold the trees, and there was a deputy, and he was sort of standing in front of the bulldozer and trying to prevent this from happening. It didn't go very well for the people trying to defend the trees. The bulldozers came, they uprooted one tree, a lot of people started getting hurt. A few dozen people, they were being tear gassed, they were being hit with, their tents were being burnt. And here's a difference to past. Turkey is a very wired country. It's not a very poor country compared to the region, and a lot of people, and the traffic's awful, so you got to have a phone because your phone will tell you how bad the traffic is on a scale of 1 to 10. It's usually 8, 9, and 10. So you just want to, at least take the 8 instead of 10. You'll have maps. You'll be able to tell people, I'm late again because the traffic's bad. You need a phone, basically, to live in Istanbul. So a lot of people had smartphones, and they started using Twitter, which they knew did not cooperate with the Turkish government to give their identities, to tell people, we're protecting these trees, and they're coming with the bulldozers. Now, this is not really like the biggest cause in Turkey, but it had become a symbol, so a few more people showed up. And they tried to protect the trees. And then they tweeted it out, and they called people and texted people. And this is happening in the middle of the city. People turned on television to find out, wait, what's going on? And they met the famous penguins. So imagine this. In the middle of New York, there is a major protest going on with a huge conflict, and the police are sending tear gas, and hundreds and thousands of, not hundreds of thousands, but hundreds of people, and then thousands of people are showing up in increasing numbers. And you turn on TV, CNN Turkey, and you see penguins. You're like, hey, news, hello. And then you turn the other channel, and there's a cooking show. And you're like, wait, are my friends who are tweeting that there's a major protest, are they crazy? So since it's in a major square, people went, and they're like, oh yes, there's a major protest, and they started tweeting from it too, and then more people came. People were upset about the trees. The people were upset about the police tear gassing the protesters. The people were also upset about how much the media was directly lying to them, because they could now confirm through their own eyes and through their social media what was going on. So that was the origin of the protest. And then it grew from there, and it's still not over. I was just checking Twitter, and now in Ankara, in ODTÜ, which is a major university, I'm hearing more tear gas, conflict, fights, because they also want to raise through the campus, which is this green campus, to build another highway. What an idea. So let's double back to the NSA surveillance story that I started, because, you know, this whole month I was in Turkey, I kept hearing from people how important the internet was for them to be able to organize, how they finally realized that they weren't alone, how they figured how to coordinate. People were coordinating online. They were like, okay, in the street there's a lot of tear gas, now you should go there. They were coordinating the latest news. They were coordinating supplies. They were coordinating tips. It was just a lot of coordination. So I kept hearing people talk about how great the internet was for their political movement. And at the same time, when I went online, I kept reading these stories of what the US government and the National Security Agency was doing, which was, now here's the summary of what we now know, is that they are working with pretty much every major platform, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Skype, which is Microsoft, Yahoo, you name it, they got it, except Twitter. So they have access to their user data. They are tapping the fiber networks that are the backbone of the internet to get all that traffic. They are collecting what's called metadata, which is who called whom information on pretty much every phone call in the country, so everybody you've ever called. They are also intentionally weakening encryption standards so that they can listen to every conversation that's going on. Now, they claim they're not listening to it all. They claim they're not listening to it all, but they're collecting all of this data in one way or another. Now, how does this relate to the protests? What it says to us is that there are two futures for what this technology can be, and it can both happen at the same time, and then one might win over it completely. This technology is, on the one hand, a great way for us to talk to each other, and talking to each other, as I said, is a very inherently political act, because that's the basis of all collective action and all social movements. At some point, you have to talk to each other. It's also a technology that allows massive surveillance and massive snooping by corporations, by governments, and by people who have power over you. And it's yet unclear whether internet's ability to deliver all your communication to the government versus its ability to connect you to your fellow human beings, which one is going to win out? And this is far from settled, because the rules and the laws and the corporations that are running the internet are still very much being shaped. So there is something for, you know, everybody who's interested in these things to pay attention to, because in 10 or 20 years, history of technology tells us it will become black box. It will become something. And then people will say, that's just the way it is. Of course the government knows everything you do. Of course every corporation knows everything you do. Whereas right now we're horrified by that idea. We're not used to that idea. It's a good thing not to be used to that idea yet, because there's time to say, let's see if there's something that can be done with it. And it's important to understand these tools in their political context and figure out where they may take us, and not look at it as a spectator sport where you just get on Facebook and chat with your friends. Because what Facebook can do and how it's designed and what it does with the government of US or Turkey and what it doesn't is inherently political, and that's going to impact everything in your life and all the issues that we face. So I just want to end there and urge people to just check out what's going on and try to learn that what is going on, they're not just screens, they're tools of connectivity. And it's important that we understand and try to shape them and not just, you know, share cat pictures, though you're free to share cat pictures with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab. Let me invite Dori, if we can, to give her presentation, and then afterwards we're going to leave time for audience Q&A and participation. Are you more comfortable there or here? Where would you? As you like, as you like.
So good evening, everybody, and thank you, Shokran, for coming here today. Why do the Egyptian people take to the streets? Some years ago, maybe at the beginning of the 21st century, some activists took to the streets in downtown Cairo, tens in the beginning, then few hundreds. They had the sign of kifaya, enough, as stickers closing their mouth. They used to stand in silence in front of the journalist syndicate or in front of the judge's club. Then they started walking in downtown Cairo streets, beating few drums. People in the streets used to first laugh, then smile, then think, is this really possible to say enough to corrupt old Mubarak? Is it possible to have a change in such peaceful way? That openly, that simple? Are the masses able together to achieve? Is it possible to get workers' rights by demonstration, by sit-in, or even civil disobedience, like the civil disobedience of the 6th of April 2008 in all Egypt? All Egypt had disobedience at that day. That date, 6th of April, and later on the 6th of April became the name of a movement. It was because of the previous year of crushing violently the industrial delta city of Mahalla, workers sit-in. When the revolution started in January 25, 2011, the invitation was mainly from those several movements, 6th of April and Kifaya, enough, and some others. In 2011, they were better prepared, using social media means, Facebook, Twitter, SMS, Skype training sessions with European peaceful protest movements. The choice of 25th of January was because of the Police Memorial Day. The year before, the social media showed the picture of Khaled Said, a young man in his 20s from Alexandria who was killed brutally by the police because he posted on the internet a video showing how corrupt and the police was, still is actually. The picture of his innocent face beside the picture of his dead face, beaten, cut, bruised, and mashed and smashed completely, moved many, many Egyptians. Not only because what happened to him can happen to anybody, but also because nearly everyone can tell a terrible story of how the police became not for protecting the Egyptian people, but for protecting Mubarak and his regime. At that time, many organized groups, like the official parties and like the Muslim Brothers, for example, found that peaceful demonstrations rather ridiculous. They preferred to play the regime's game of democracy. They had election agreements with Mubarak regime and prevented their followers from participating in such chaotic actions with Kifaya or with the workers in Mahalla. The Muslim Brothers oppositely had their masked militia show in November 2006 in front of Al-Azhar Mosque for the sake of liberating Jerusalem. Why are the Egyptian people still taking to the streets until now? The main slogan for the 25th of January 2011 revolution was عيش, حرية, عدالة اجتماعية, which means bread, freedom, social justice. Well, the Egyptians did not get what they have asked for. After all these years, after all that blood which was sacrificed. This semester, I'm starting my 5th year here in Chapel Hill. I go to Egypt twice a year. I can see big change every time I go. The people are much more aware. At any given time or place, you hear amazing discussions between simple people who don't even know each other. They say openly, no more fear. Eyes opened. We have the power. We can make history. we can express our dreams, and change can happen according to our will. The people, the usual people in the streets all over Egypt, not only in Cairo, became politicized. They are ready to stand against any attempt to abort their dreams, and they're looking forward for the future they wish for themselves and for their children. They are much more proud of themselves and proud of their way of life, proud of their moderate way they practice their religions, and they decided after the last year rule of the Muslim Brothers that they do not want anybody to try to put them down again. And I guess that was the reason for all those millions taking to the streets again on June 30th, 2013. The invitation came this time from Harakat Tamarrud, or the rebel movement. They are few young people, all of them less than 30 years old, who went all over Egypt to collect signatures asking for early presidency election. 22 million signed this petition. Again, that was all over Egypt, not only in Cairo. I'm repeating this because it's really unusual to hear people's voice outside Cairo. When I was asked to talk today, I thought, what can I say in such dark and sad time? First thing has to be said is condemning the killing, all the killing. Condemning the killers, all the killers. I think we should reject the binaries that the Egyptians are being forced into about choosing one side over the other, about saying the army is right, the army is wrong, the Muslim Brothers are right, the Muslim Brothers are wrong. They are both wrong. They are fundamentally, utterly wrong. They are both fundamentally fascist organizations. We are in a revolution. This term has become complicated in so many people's minds. What that means is we are trying to build the new state anew, something that is very difficult to understand very often for foreign audiences. But until we have a new constitution that represents everybody, until we have the organs of the state protecting people's rights, we are going to keep changing from one power to the other, to the next, and they are going to come back trying to enforce their agendas. But the good news is, I guess, or I hope, that the Egyptian people will keep taking to the streets until they fulfill their dreams of bread, freedom, and social justice. عيش, حرية, عدالة اجتماعية. شكراً, and thank you for listening.
Robert, let me invite you to also join us. Would you like to be on the table or up here?
I'll come sit.
All right. So allow me just to say a word about you as you're coming. Robert is a professor of public policy and history and the co-director of the program on history, public policy, and social change at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke. But you have to love him because he received his bachelor's and PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Korstad is an expert on 20th century U.S. history, labor history, African American history, contemporary social policy, and he's a co-director of the major documentary research project at Duke's Center for Documentary Studies titled Behind the Veil, documenting African American life in the Jim Crow South. Please welcome Dr. Robert Korstad.
I think I will just sit here if that's okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay now. Okay, so thank you, and it's nice to be here. Sorry I'm a little late. I had a group of students on a field trip, and we were a little slower getting back into town than we expected. So Raleigh is probably the last place in the world most of you would expect to be part of this global protest movement that we're hearing about today. But over the course of the past spring and summer, thousands of North Carolinians have taken to the streets in Raleigh and increasingly in smaller towns around the state. And over 900 people have been arrested for civil disobedience at the General Assembly in Raleigh. And I was one of those. The New York Times has editorialized against the recent political changes and public policies in North Carolina, and the national media and national talk shows have had, seems like a whole series of people coming to try to explain why this state of North Carolina, which used to be so progressive, seems now to be so conservative, and what all these people are doing out in the streets. Now, in the case of North Carolina, as in many of the other, most of the other global protests we're talking about, these people in Raleigh, including myself, were upset with the policies and the practices of their government. In this case, not their national government, although they're upset about a lot of those too, but in particular, the state government. And this all began, well, it's been going on for a little while, but it really began last fall with the election of a conservative Republican majority in both the House and the Senate in the General Assembly, and the election of a Republican governor. And as we've seen the other day, that they have a super veto majority in both houses, and even overruled two of the governor's vetoes. I think people had some sense from the last legislative session that once the Republicans got that kind of control, that there were going to be changes. After all, Democrats had effectively ruled North Carolina politics for decades, and despite occasional Republican governors in the post-1960s, the Democrats had really retained control of the General Assembly and most of the legislative and policy making. But I think when the legislation that started to come out in the mid-spring through the General Assembly this year, it could only really be described as revolutionary. And day after day after day, I know I and many people, other people, were astounded by the bills that seemed to move forward with record speed through the General Assembly, that swept back changes that have been made in education, social welfare programs, and decades of voting rights were being underdone, and many of the, in effect, wiping out a lot of the gains that have been won since the civil rights movement. And I'll just mention a few. How many of you from North Carolina in here? Probably quite a good number. Okay, so if you've been reading the newspaper or listening to the radio, you are fairly aware of a lot of this. Extensive tax cuts for corporations and for wealthy North Carolinians, cuts of various sorts in education funding and the particular ways in which education was funded, the refusal to support an increase in Medicaid recipients through accessing money from the federal government, the shortening of unemployment benefits, the whole voter ID bill, the shortening of the vote, same-day, the doing away with same-day registration in many cases, shortening early voting, now we're moving all the precincts that are on college campuses as far away as we can, so the students won't vote. You're going to have to go home to vote if you can vote at all. You know, a lot of the arguments that were made were that these cuts were needed to balance the budget. We are in a difficult fiscal time, and also to create a better environment, business environment for corporations and to increase the kind of economic growth in the United States. The voting laws, which in fact are some of the most stringent, were said to prevent fraud and other kind of manipulation of the voting, for which there was no evidence that there ever was any of that, although the governor assured us that if we needed to find it, he could find it after the fact, after they changed all the laws. Now, this movement really began, I think, in May with under the leadership of the NAACP, with particularly the president of the NAACP, Reverend William Barber, the HJ-on-K, which is a coalition of progressive groups from around North Carolina. There are dozens and dozens. They hold a march and a protest every in February, I think, in Raleigh. And so people had been very involved. This is a group of people who have been very involved in the Wake County School Board elections and stuff. So they'd done a lot of groundwork, and they'd built a lot of coalitions, and they really knew how to do their work. So that was the first group that decided, really almost not spontaneously, but not having thought through it a lot, to actually get arrested the first time at the General Assembly. I was in the second group, and that was an effort to really reach out to professors and scholars and other people like me around the state, particularly around here. My wife, who's a UNC professor, was also arrested, and a number of colleagues at Duke and Central and other places, to try to give the movement some legitimacy, so it wasn't just the same group of people who had been protesting, or not just Reverend Barber and a few of his friends. And I think that actually worked quite well, because the media picked up on it and was very receptive to start talking about and showing some of these new and different faces. Then came, kind of every week, another group was placed in a more prominent role with healthcare workers, doctors. So you had lots of doctors up with their robes and their stethoscopes and all their doctor paraphernalia. Religious leaders, obviously, from the beginning. It was an incredibly ecumenical group, prayers in multiple languages and from multiple traditions. Women's organizations, particularly around reproductive rights issues. The labor movement was a little bit of a latecomer, but was very prominent, and the Secretary-Treasurer has been very involved in that. And then the last big rally, which in Raleigh, involved thousands of teachers from across North Carolina, all of whom wore red shirts to protest. I thought I was at a North Carolina State tailgate party, but fortunately I wasn't. One of the most interesting things to me about this, and something that's very unusual in North Carolina, I think, is the diversity of the group. I study social movements in North Carolina. I can't think of protests that have looked like this at any time in our history. The protesters are probably 80 to 85% white, a little more than their percentage in North Carolina, and I think that changes from week to week. Probably a small majority of women, although I haven't looked at the numbers. Increasingly middle class orientation, people who wouldn't have been out there doing that months ago or several years ago, but who've become so frustrated, I think, with particular changes in education and other kinds of policies like that. They've been out there too. So it's really drawn in an interracial, kind of multi-age, cross-class alliance that most of us who have been activists for years in North Carolina just dream about. Now, it doesn't mean it's as large or has been as powerful as it should, at least from my perspective, but it's there. And the other interesting thing about it is it's an interracial movement made up predominantly of whites who are following black leadership. And this is unheard of in the United States. I mean, other than the election of President Obama, but certainly unheard of in the South. So I think that's one of the really unique things here that's made this successful. So a few things about what's made it work. The leadership and charisma of Reverend Barber, if you haven't seen him speak, if you haven't been up close when he's speaking, he is an increasingly inspiring person. I heard him give a talk at the last rally in Raleigh, and it's really unbelievable. You should try to find clips of it on TV to look at. I think the movement's made an excellent use of the media, particularly television and newspapers. You know, we've been writing op-eds that get published regularly. We're on TV all the time, on National Public Radio. So we've been able to get into the major circuits. But there's also been a lot of social media, particularly used to organize people to get to the rallies. And I mean, there are all kinds of last-minute changes, you know, for at least the first few weeks. No, we're not going to meet at that church. We're meeting at that church. And, you know, if we hadn't had, you know, all the social media, we'd all be running around the place lost. I think the anger, another thing that's made it work, is increasing anger of ordinary North Carolinians about the kind of policies that were being put forth. And then finally, and I'll kind of end on this somewhat, this discussion, I think that the multiple moral frameworks that both Reverend Barber and the other leaders have used to explain the protest and to motivate the protesters has, from my perspective, been the key to this. So what I mean, multiple moral frameworks. Obviously, the religious framework is predominant here, and it's not just, it's you know, Old Testament, New Testament, the Quran. It's that, you know, we're drawing on a lot of different religious texts and traditions, but a lot of them are making an argument that, you know, these policies, this treatment of the poor, this treatment of the marginalized, is somehow a violation of the meaning of religion and wrong in God's eyes. You know, we're doing something against God's will. And that, even though that language resonates in all of the discussions, all the presentations, and is there all the time. But I think what's important is there are other moral arguments that are being made alongside that one. One is a more moral, kind of ethical language, kind of in classical moral philosophy. That asserts that these actions by the General Assembly are wrong because they discriminate against people, or they treat people differently when public policy is supposed to be more independent and not to pay particular attention to any one person's need over any other person's need. There's a very utilitarian argument that gets made in all of Barber's teachings or speeches, that this is not in the best interest of the majority. So it's almost, kind of a moral cost-benefit analysis. What we're doing is going to ultimately ruin our state because we're disinvesting in education. And if we don't invest in education, we're not going to have a trained workforce to get for these people who want to come here and work. The third language is a political language, and it's a language of democracy and democratic theory. And it really argues that the policies that are coming out of the General Assembly are degradations of our democratic way of life. Basically, we're taking away the political participation, the rights that are guaranteed to us in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, all that. So as I said, the religious language seems to be the dominant one, and I've got lots of friends and people I've talked to are, they're a little uneasy with all these preachers up on stage, and it just seems like there's some days there's a steady stream of religious leaders from all kind of backgrounds and stuff. And I've heard a few people complain a little bit about this, but you don't have to wait around long to hear Reverend Barber voice your own particular oppositional stance. Okay? So Moral Mondays have been successful, I think, because it's been presented as a complex, in a complex way, and using moral arguments that come from a variety of traditions that appeal to a variety of North Carolinians, secular, religious, people who are kind of more moderate, others who are much more radical. And I think it's created not only it's created a kind of language umbrella, oppositional umbrella in which a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds can get under. It's really interesting. It's going to be interesting to see where we go from here. I start I have to do 25 hours of community service, and I start that tomorrow. Hopefully, helping people register to vote or do something like that. But we're working with different nonprofits to do our time. But I think that all of these factors portend a lot of success as this movement goes forward, and it's really interesting to think of it in the context of the things that are going on in other parts of the world, and it's great to see North Carolina taking its rightful place in this kind of revolutionary time. So, thank you.
Yeah. So what I would like to do would be to open up the dialogue and conversation now. And the way that I would like to invite you to do so is to stand up, put your hands up, and identify if there is a particular speaker that you would like to have first crack at this conversation. And the only rule is that it be a question that ends in a question mark, that's short, that you can say it in a couple of breaths. It should not require paragraphs or bylaws. We're not looking for diatribes. We're not looking for sermons. Questions. So the floor is yours, and just feel free to let me know which one of us you would like to have start. Yeah, please.
My name is Eric. Duria, you were in Egypt this summer, and Thank you. You were in Egypt this summer, and I was just wondering, what do you think, given your personal experience, is a better representation of Egyptian democracy? What happened at the ballot box, and should those results have been upheld, or is, the spontaneous demonstration of so many millions of Egyptians? The spontaneous is a better representation of Egyptian democracy, respecting the results of the ballot box that put Morsi into power, or is it the spontaneous or near spontaneous demonstrations of so many millions of Egyptians? Which, are you torn on that? Which do you think was closer to what the people wanted? Or what in your opinion, I didn't end that very well. But do you understand?
I understand,
Okay.
but you think you are asking about my opinion or about the Egyptian people?
Yeah, as somebody who was there this summer, you can never get the opinion of the entirety of the Egyptian people.
Yeah. I think the Egyptian people, they enjoyed very much since the revolution, the real democracy of having election and of having to vote in a real observed and and that the election is not fog, it's not a game. And we could see lines and lines of people standing in front of the voting schools and centers to wait for vote in the heat, in the rain. It was amazing, and everybody really enjoyed this and felt that it's what they deserve after all this time of struggling about democracy. But what happened during after electing, there were a lot of constitutional mistakes that led to many problems, fundamental problems in the election procedure itself for the parliament, and even after that to have the president, and what are the terms. We are new in this, so what are the terms that the president should be elected upon and all this. But after all, people were satisfied that the election was fair, and the president who was elected is the one who deserved its place. But then there were a lot of measurements that happened during this year that made the people really somehow, and me too, somehow recognize that there is not, that it's not what they expected of a democracy procedure. I mean, there were constitutional measurements that the president would take and announce to people that he would make him a pharaoh. Nobody can reject his orders. Nobody can criticize him. He put him in his hands, the parliament and the judge authorities. I mean, it was, and many other things that made the Egyptian people feel that this is going not the right way. And they felt that this group that they got, the president, when he was elected, he said, I'm elected. It's not where I belong. It doesn't matter, I'm a Muslim brother, but I'm Mohammed Morsi, I'm the one who's ruling. What proved later on was not this. The ruling was in the hands of the group of the Muslim brothers. And the Egyptian, even in the countryside, even from very simple people I know, they recognize that there are some measurements the Muslim brothers are taking that they can hold the power for 500 years as they many times announced. So coming, getting rid of this, or going over the democratic election, or the ballot as you call it, I'm not sure of the right word, was not the first choice, but it was sort of the only choice, or we are going to be stuck in this taking the joints of the state, and by the end of the 4 years, you would never be able to get rid of this type of rule, because from the first place, the measurements of the democratic life was not followed. Okay, I hope I answered.
Professor Safi, I have a question about Turkey. Do you think, in light of the protests that and the rightward swing of Erdogan, is decreasing his popularity? Is he likely to get elected again?
I ironically actually think that Erdogan has proven himself to be a very skillful manipulator of public opinion. And after he crushed many of the demonstrations in Gezi Park and gave these speeches, which, and I don't use these kinds of words very lightly, but they had a fascist quality to them. It was sort of one fearless leader standing in front of a sea of bussed-in supporters. And to hear him say things not only identifying people as outsiders and terrorists, but also to end up making statements along the lines of, we are watching social media, and people that have expressed support for these hooligans we're going to find out who you are. And ironically, his support went up. His support went up, and it's probably now hovering somewhere between 60% or so. We run into the difficulty of the fact that the AKP has been economically very successful in building up the Turkish economy. Ironically, I mean, they are the Republicans. They're the ones who know how to get these big corporate corrupt deals done. And they're also the same party that, so I mean, here's one of the ironies that I always end up mentioning to people, and I know that we have people much more knowledgeable than me that who should correct what I have said. But the irony of it is that Turkey is the place where the so-called Islamist party, or as they like to call themselves, Islamically leaning parties, are the Republicans, are the internationalists, and the secular parties in Turkey tend to be the nationalists who are anti-EU, anti-fitting into sort of larger international patterns because they're afraid of losing their distinctive Turkishness. So dealing with the particularity of Turkish politics is important, and also being willing to say that a successful economy doesn't make you a democracy. And that's what I liked about the question that our friend asked earlier, is we have to insist that democracy necessitates fair and transparent voting, open up as wide as possible to the citizens of the society that we in North Carolina would do well to emulate, but also insist that democracy not be reduced to voting. Voting is simply one apparatus, and there are many other measurements for a robust and vibrant democracy, and the ability to speak and to speak freely, though it be to criticize one's government, especially if it is to criticize one's government, without fear of reprisal, without fear of surveillance. I mean, these are lessons that those of us not only in Turkey, but also here in the United States, I think increasingly are feeling these days. But
I have another tricky question. Okay, I'll use it. My question is, why did all the social media, different forms of social media, why were they allowed to stay open this summer in Turkey? I know that in the past, Turkey has shut down YouTube, but this summer, Twitter, everything was still open.
Yeah. So it's complicated, but let me just say, Turkey is not, a country like China. That's not where it stands in the world economy. That's not where it stands politically. And this is something that's been called a dictator's dilemma. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's only experienced by dictators. But these are tools everybody uses, partly to share their cat videos. And I keep coming back to the cat videos. They're actually an essential part of the psychology. These are tools that people use every day to do everyday things, right? They talk to their friends, they keep in touch with people, they share funny things, they share frivolous things, they do the mundane. So they're so thoroughly integrated into people's lives in Turkey that if you try to unplug it, there would be a massive, massive displeasure. One, because people use it for the serious and the trivial. Two, it's another way of infantilizing people. It would get a backlash because the censorship of the tools would just cause people to react against that. Three, it would cripple a lot of businesses. I mean, these aren't just things that are used for one thing. They're used for multiple things, right? So internet isn't, or Twitter or Facebook, sometimes you turn on Facebook and you can't believe I'm on this. But sometimes, I have so many Middle Eastern friends, and it's where I get my Syria news, right? It's a lot of things at once. So for a government to stop it, to unplug it, it would hamper businesses, it would hamper people's ordinary use, it would have this backlash. The other thing is, because I'm so involved and with so many Arab Spring activists, Facebook for me is a difficult place now because I turn it on and I log on and there are mangled babies pictures all the time because I've been getting so much Syria awful coverage. It rarely makes the news unless the internet is shut down and all of a sudden the whole world is interested. It's just become this media thing. If the internet is shut down, you get a lot of international media attention. It's like a Mubarak effect. And the leaders in Turkey were very much aware of this. You can do anything but shut the internet. You know, you can kill 100,000 people, and it only took a chemical weapons attack to get it back in the news. But you shut down the internet, I'd see news, major mainstream news, that the internet is shut down. So there's a huge backfiring of the internet as an international symbol of how backward you are. You're shutting off the internet, so that would not be something they wanted to do. The third thing is, in the case of Tahrir, in my interviews where they did shut down not just internet but cell phones, what happened in a lot of my interviews, what people have told me, is that there were people who were kind of on the sidelines watching this, and they were keeping in touch with people in Tahrir, and you can correct me, and all of a sudden, you can't get news from them. You go there. You know where to go. It would be the same in Turkey. If you shut it down, there were so many people watching this on social media, and if all of a sudden they couldn't get news, the protest already had an established place. You knew where to go, Gezi, Tahrir. If it had no place to go, that's another thing. So that's one more reason they didn't cut it off. The final thing is, the YouTube blockage is kind of misunderstood. They didn't really block it in the way that Iran or China blocks something, where you just can't get at it. It was partly trying to get Google to open an office in Turkey. So they never blocked the proxies. Everybody I knew in Turkey knew how to get on YouTube. Everybody. There was no difficulty getting on YouTube, whereas in China or Iran, where there's more deeper censorship, it's not easy. Why do they want Google in the country? So that's interesting, because if Google is in the country, and it has an office in the country, and Facebook is in Turkey, you can compel it to obey Turkish laws, which include turning over user information. So, shutting off YouTube wasn't, you can't get at YouTube censorship. It was more like, we are going to block ad revenue for you, Google, from Turkey, unless you open an office, which allows us to both get tax revenue, which is, I'm not against that, but also for them to have people, staff on the ground, who are at risk if you disobey them. During the whole protest, the government has been, the prime minister called social media menace and curse to society. That's how much they hated what was going on. They went to Twitter, they went to Facebook, they went to Google, they wanted information. And, I mean, nobody tweet this or say this, but I'm not even sure if Twitter was just like going, haha. I'm not sure if they were really, they were taking it seriously, of course, but I don't think they were considering turning over that data at any point, because there's nothing to compel them, because they had no office in Turkey, and they were not going to turn over their user data to a government that was doing this. Whereas Facebook and Google had a difficult choice to make. If they get a legal request, and it's very complicated, so I'm going to cut it off. The legal requests come in many different flavors. They had to ponder how much they were going to resist, or whether they were going to pull out. In the case of China, Google pulled out of China because they couldn't just find that balance. So that's why social media is not something that is easy for a not completely authoritarian, totalitarian, closed society to just selectively unplug. I mean, nobody wants to be North Korea, right?
Hello, my name is Ari. First of all, I'd like to say I'm really grateful for this Here and Now series, because I think it's very important that we engage in dialogues about current events that are happening in our world, because we are all related to it, whether we see it or not. My question is for you, Professor Safi, because you reminded me that President Obama is a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and I was wondering, what do you think is preventing him from seeing an alternative option to attacking Syria? And do you think it's important to acknowledge other options, and why?
So let me just begin by saying that what I have to say about President Obama is both immensely personal, but also a matter of principle. It's immensely personal because I've been following his career since he was coming up through Chicago politics. And I had an early blog supporting him for president when no one thought that he really stood much of a chance. And, you know, I was one of the people who knew about the Hussein in Barack Hussein Obama and actually found that a sign of America's strength as opposed to a curse word that it eventually became in a presidential election. But going back to the example of Dr. King, he reminded us that there can be no great disappointment where there's also not great love. And I have an immense amount of love for President Obama and for the potential of charismatic, intelligent leadership that he represents. And if there is an equally profound disappointment, it's because of the political machinery that we have allowed to be created, where the most beautiful and charismatic and intelligent of us end up sounding like Bush Light, which is, for all practical purposes, what President Obama has become. We'll get to Syria in just a second. Had it been President Bush who had authorized hundreds and hundreds of drones killing thousands of civilians and hundreds of children, you can imagine where the majority of liberals and progressives in this country would be lining up. By and large, we have remained silent because it's President Obama and not President Bush. And that's unacceptable. If murder is murder, it doesn't matter who the murderer is and what the emblem of their political party is. If we take a look at what President Obama has done in Guantanamo, where 164 people are being held, even though more than half of them have been cleared to be released, and they are in this indefinite imprisonment where they have stayed. We would rather die by going on hunger strikes than to remain in this Kafkaesque universe that you have created for us. I don't care if he is an eloquent, charismatic Democrat. That action is immoral and violates the very fabric of not only international human rights, but also American democracy. And then when it gets to the question of Syria, President Obama told us not so long ago that Syria did not have a military solution, that there could only be political solutions. And if that's the case, and I would like us to hold him to that word, where are the political solutions? Why is it that the two options that we're being presented with is acquiescence in the face of genocide or unilateral military action? Why is it that we are silent when the president shifts the debate from the international community, which is where it belongs, to stating, I could decide to bomb them myself as the commander-in-chief, but I'm not going to do that because we are Americans and we don't do that. I'm going to take this to the Congress. No. The actual place to take this to is to the international community and allow them to have a vote, and allow them to be participants in this process. If President Obama insists that there is a political solution, and I think there is, the real question that we should be asking is, why is it that when the president of Iran, the newly elected president of Iran, who, by the way, just sent out Lashana Tova on his Twitter account, right? So this is not the same presidency that Iran had last year. When that presidency condemns chemical weapon usage in Syria, why is President Obama not going to President Rouhani and Russia and allowing us to have that conversation in light of international norms? If the president talks about how these weapons are killing people, why are we not having the international conversation about placing an embargo on the sale of arms to Syria, not only from the American side, but also from the Russian side? We can get the Russians to agree to things. We got them to agree to sanctions against Iran, where our response has been, no, let's go ahead and arm the Syrian freedom fighters, many of whom we know are actually aligned with Al-Qaeda. And remember when Chomsky talks about how consent is manufactured. He says the way that you manufacture consent is actually by restricting the range whereby intelligent critical debate can take place. Within that, you allow people to argue as much as they want. And that's essentially what we, all of us, have allowed to take place within the reign of President Obama, who is now become a participant in taking the American Republic and making it into an American empire by giving us this very limited range of options. Are we going to bomb Syria because he says so? Or are we going to bomb Syria after the Congress says so? What we should be pushing for is actually to broaden those range of possibilities and say, where is the international community? Yes, there should be an intervention. No, it shouldn't take the chemical death of 1,400 innocent people. It should have taken way before 100,000 people were killed for the international community to have a humanitarian intervention to ban the use of chemical weapons, of which we ourselves continue to be one of the largest producers of, and to work with our allies and to talk with people we don't like, because that's what grown-ups do. That's what human beings are supposed to do. And I think we need to be having this conversation not only for the sake of those tens of thousands of people in Syria, but also for the sake of our own fledgling democracy.
Thank you. I have a question for Professor Korstad. You said a little bit about, referred to your community service, which is coming up beginning tomorrow, the 24 hours, and suggested that perhaps you would be working with voter registration. I wanted to hear more about any kind of organization or just sort of heartfelt movement that's going for people like you who were arrested and have that 24 hours. How you're going to spend that? Is there any organization about that? It seems like it's a second wave of commitment.
I think it's been a little confusing in terms of finding, exactly the kinds of things that we're going to do. I mean, basically the ruling from the district attorney was that we all had to do 25 hours. I mean, that was an option. Otherwise, you could actually contest your case if you want, but it takes a lot of time, drag out for a few years, and you're using unpaid lawyers who have better things to do. So 25 hours of community service, which meant they defined as working for any kind of legitimate nonprofit organization. So in this, so we went right away to start looking for some nonpartisan organizations that were working around voting rights. And so, we work, I think some of us are going to work with Democracy North Carolina. There are a lot of, if you see, when Senator Kinnaird resigned last week, the first thing she did was to announce that she's going to be setting up a project working with some already existing groups to try to counteract some of the more onerous aspects of the voting rights. So there's a lot of stuff springing up that's come in the last 2 or 3 weeks. But I think there's going to be actually quite a groundswell over the next year of groups going out. I mean, I've already seen some really sophisticated plans for how we're going to get voter IDs to people. I mean, one of the things that the Obama campaign did in the success in 2008 and 2012 was to collect huge amounts of information on voters in North Carolina, and it was given by them freely. But those databases are really critical in finding, people who don't have IDs or people who are in situations where it's going to be difficult for them to vote. So it's going to be a lot easier to target. And then the churches and the other organizations in the state are doing a good job of that. So I think you'll see, and then I'm hoping I work with a group called Scholars for North Carolina's Future, and we do forums. We're going to actually do one in this room in about 3 weeks talking about some of these same issues again. But North Carolina students are among the people who are getting hit hardest by this. And it's not just the most egregious ones like Appalachian State, where they're moving the early voting site off campus. But they're going to be challenged in all kinds of different ways. And the State Board of Elections, which is controlled by Republicans now, are going to be supporting the decisions of electoral boards in individual counties. So there's going to have to be a lot of kind of grassroots work on that level, and I'm hoping that students become one of the next mobilized groups when they understand that their citizenship rights are being taken away from them. So I'm looking forward to these young people, even those who left, to be the spark plug for that.
Hey, my name is Zach, and I have a question for Professors Zeynep and Durriya. I think one of the main issues in countries like Tunisia, Egypt, and Turkey is the overwhelming polarization on social issues and on issues of identity and of religion. Do you think that the increasing connectivity of the world, not only on a social level, but also on a political level, on a level of systems, whether be it world powers or world organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, do you think that this increasingly overwhelming exposure to different expectations and different ways of doing things is blurring a debate on identity in these issues and preventing people in these countries from reaching a consensus on issues of identity?
As I was listening to the North Carolina protests, one thing that struck me was some of the similarities that we have seen in these coalitions that you talked about first, is that a lot of these protests have been big tent coalitions, and in the case of the Egyptian, there was a lot of the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, was out there in force in large numbers in the initial Tahrir protests, along with other groups and secular groups and liberal groups as well. But the polarization, this unity for a one-level goal, which is we want Mubarak to resign, has turned out fairly hard to continue afterwards. This we see in the Gezi protests. Turkish politics is traditionally quite sectarian and polarized. But what I observed in my interviews was that there was this great thirst for just pluralism and diversity, because they felt like the government had been othering them the way it's been described, and sort of describing them as these alien, crazy, terrorist, looter, this, that, and the other. And they felt like that they were being attacked on identity issues so hard that they really, really wanted to have a very diverse space. So this Gezi became a place in which you had a group called Revolutionary Muslims, who were progressive Muslims, held prayers, and they on Prophet's date of birth they had the sort of prayers, and they were there, along with you name it, every part of group, besides the AKP, everything from like the social democrat groups to just youth to labor unions and theater. It was just this incredibly diverse place. And a lot of groups that had never conversed, like supporters of, say, the Kurdish movement and supporters from very Turkish nationalist movements, found themselves facing the same tear gas, and that really helps with that unity and diversity argument, because first you realize, wait, we're in this together, and second, you don't have time to have the argument because you're getting tear gas and you better run. Third, it humanizes you, because after the tear gas is over, you start talking to people, and it's like, okay, these people aren't crazy, they don't have horns and tails, they're just people, and they have this political point of view. So Gezi itself was very, very diverse. Tahrir, the original protest, was very, very diverse. Now, here's where I think social media is a shortcoming, is that I think diverse coalitions are quite easy to organize these days over social media using sort of, here's our goal, here's where you come. But we haven't really figured out how to do this institutionalization of these diverse conversations that happen during the burst of the protests, and then everybody goes home. And then the polarization dynamics start playing out again. And since social media, I mean, I describe it to something like people learning to cook with pre-cooked stuff, right? You can, you just don't have to do anything. You know, here's your chopped onions, here's your chopped carrots. Social media kind of allows you to have protests like that. Whereas if you look at the history of the civil rights, they had to really, really work hard to organize the simplest thing. You know, the Montgomery bus boycott, just organizing the carpool to carry people. It was not done on social media. It was a complicated effort. They had no Excel, they had no anything, but they organized it. But that organization itself gave them capacities to do other things. So with social media, you're cooking with pre-cooked food. And then at the next step, you need to chop some onions yourself, but you've never had to do it because everything was so easy. And then I'm finding a lot of these global movements, Occupy, Arab Spring, Original Coalition, Gezi, M15, the Indignados in Spain. There's a lot of examples of very good diverse coordination for public street protests and very little follow through the institutional means. So North Carolina might be a different example because what you're describing is a sort of this traditional, the black churches and the latecomers, labor unions and other groups. They come with organizational capacity. And now if you can merge that know-how with these sort of, here's your chopped onions ease of social media, maybe we can start getting some traction, because even though we're talking about successes, to be honest, we're talking about success of protest. We are not talking success of policy. Occupy did not change policy. In Egypt, there's really difficult situations. In Turkey, AKP is, yes, definitely going to win the next election by far, no question about it. And North Carolina, well, the laws are still being passed. So there's these long-term questions which remain open. And I think it really requires what you just said, which is addressing how do you have broad coalitions persist and impact policy. And it's important to come together and say, here we are, but that's not where politics ends.
I think this answers your question, right?
Why don't we maybe have one more question and then call it a day? I think I see a question back there. And then we can shift to, hanging out together, talking, and...
Hi, my name's Brian. Here at the end, I'm going to flout one of your rules, Professor Safi. I'm going to ask an open question to whoever wants to take it. We've talked a lot about social media and the power that social media has for these protests. Do any of you have any worries about the classist nature of that? For the extremely poor that don't have access to computers and social media, do you feel that their voices are getting lost in this sort of social media revolution?
I just spoke, but I'm going to say one thing. Yes and no. In some ways, it is more democratic and participatory than most other things you have, and these tools are getting cheaper and cheaper. So in Turkey, we basically have 60 to 70% internet penetration, which in real terms means every household, everyone. So the digital divide concerns are real, and social media creates these weird hierarchies. Some people get a lot of attention, some people get less. But I think compared to other methods, show up at a meeting. Well, you got to get out of work. You got to get to the meeting. You got to have free time. I mean, there's a reason that professors can do certain things because they have flexible jobs. A lot of people have 11 hours. So being able to comment on a Facebook page might be a lot more accessible to people who are actually working long hours than, say, show up at a personal meeting. I'm not discounting how important it is to have the face-to-face meeting. I'm just saying that there's discrimination built into politics up and down and right and left. And maybe this is one tool, if we do it wisely and don't organize it in a way that benefits people, that could be that could actually help break the broader inequalities in other tools, as long as we don't forget that the tool itself also brings a bunch of some new and some old inequalities. Broadband speed, you can just, a third of U.S. countries U.S. households don't have broadband, for example. It's just, it's incredible to me that the richest country on earth and a third of households don't have broadband. I mean, it's worse than Turkey. It's crazy.
I want to say that the first wave of the revolution in 25th of January, it was mainly organized by the social media, yes, and the participants were mostly middle class, younger people who are acquainted with the social media. But what I observed this year, having the 30th of June, all over Egypt, countryside, Upper Egypt, Delta, small cities, big cities, everywhere, it's not the social media anymore. It's people moving in the streets, in the villages, in the small cities, and talking to people, and people gather each other because they had anger, they are unsatisfied about many things about their daily life. And I'm waiting for somebody who can make some studies about this, because I'm not sure how. Maybe they learned from the Muslim brothers the techniques of making filtration into the society. I don't know. But it's not social media solely anymore.
I think two things in North Carolina that, working against that kind of exclusion. One, and this was really interesting, one of the things that the NAACP and Reverend Barber did before the Moral Mondays was a tour on poverty in North Carolina, and I went on a couple of those. And they were going into small towns, into urban areas, talking to people who, in Fayetteville, they're under the bridges talking to homeless people, and so they were getting, and they heard a lot about what was on people's mind. And I think tours like that, and even it was not easy to do, but I think they got a lot of feedback from people that has been incredibly useful in thinking about the kind of policies they push. The other thing is that I think the people recognize that kind of traditional shoe leather politics are going to be ultimately what's going to be useful in this case, and that's going around, door to door, house to house, registering voters, trying to get, educate voters about the issues. And so, I think that at least in the context of North Carolina, it's going to require a little bit of all of that. But the nice thing to me, at least, is that people seem to be aware of it, and I think that's a good sign. So thanks.
I guess maybe I'll just add one more decidedly non-academic thing, and perhaps we can call it a day at that, which is to say, again, I come back to this idea that these social media are tools to allow us to connect and organize and network and mobilize. And I'm always happy when I see people use it that way. What I really want to know is not so much, do you have Facebook and Twitter and broadband? I want to know if you have a conscience. I want to know, do you care? And are you willing to say that what happens to me is connected to what happens to other people in my state and what happens to other people around the world whom I've never met, but that actually our fate and our destiny is one? And, we have a president who came to office talking about the audacity of hope, right? And there is another audacity that I think we should be thinking about, which is we've been down this road before, and we should know our own history. We should know that in the civil rights era, which is the closest thing to what many of us are trying to both participate in and create at the same time, that there were moments when it looked like all was lost. It was not this smooth, continuous progress, and that we had no less than a person of Dr. King have to take a monumental risk in Birmingham, where it looked like the movement to desegregate was running out of steam. running out of supporters, running out of hope, running out of energy. And that's when he initiated the Children's Crusade. And he took this extraordinary risk that we're going to put students on the front lines of a civil rights struggle. And it was a transformative success that in retrospect looks like a stroke of genius, but at the time was absolutely controversial. Part of what we need is for today's Children's Crusade, which might very well be a student crusade. It might very well be a movement where people say, why should I go for 4 years to the oldest, best damn public university in the country and come out with loans that I can't pay and jobs that I can't find, and at the same time have my governor be advised by the person who's gutting that same university, who's trying to eliminate everything in my university that ends in studies. Women's studies, environmental studies, Asian studies, Middle Eastern studies. And the model that they want is for a vocational school so that they can funnel more and more people into low-paying jobs without the kind of critical thinking abilities that actually produce informed citizenry. So yeah, what I am asking for is for students and children and adults and poor people and rich people to actually be able to say, my own future is what is at stake here. So let's carry on and continue, and thank you for all of you for coming.